day to all of you.
Rousing
welcome to the gospel. See, I just want to call it the gospel, Jake.
Now you're really pulling them in.
I know. We got it. Hey, hit like, hit subscribe, hit that notification bell, or wherever you may be viewing or listening to us. So, the last couple of weeks, we've been kind of in this Christendom, history of Christianity, and we're kind of bringing that full circle to modern day. Here we're at in 2020.
Yeah.
What's that mean for the church? And you're the man with notes and highlighters.
I did bring notes.
You're doing great. So
I do have a highlighter.
Yeah. So Nathan, we'll have you kind of take it away. We'll jump in where we.
Before we get started, something that we had talked about doing and have not done is bring everyone up to speed on the coffee that we're drinking.
Oh, yes, very important.
And I say that, and it's a bit of a surprise to you too. So today we are
this
trying.
wasn't in the notes.
No, it was not. No, it's not in my notes. Today we are trying Kalamazoo Coffee Company. What is this? The Backpackers
Blend.
Backpackers Blend. So good
very
stuff.
good.
Shout out to Kalamazoo Coffee.
Yes.
Good stuff, guys.
Picked that up at Meyer, I think.
Yeah,
right?
got it at Meyer. Yeah,
Yep.
right on the shelf.
Good stuff.
Okay, so let me mute that
Some
so that doesn't
background
happen
music.
again. Yeah. So like you said, we have been talking about just where the church has been. Understanding your history is important if you want to understand where you're going. So starting with the history of the church and what has led us to this point helps us have a foothold on what is next, where we're going. So I thought I'd start with Isaiah chapter 43. I love this verse and the context, and we won't get into kind of breaking down the context of what is written here, but Isaiah 43, verse 19, this is God speaking, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." And part of the reason I love that verse is because it reveals a God that is not just sticking with the way that he's always called his people, not sticking with a formula of the way that he's always communicated with his people. God doesn't change, but the world continues to change. Mm-hmm. And so this is for me is just a good reminder that as things change, it's okay because God is already ahead of that. Yeah. He knows that these things are changing. He knows that there is this evolution of how people understand, how they relate to one another. In fact, that's kind of where I want to begin our conversation. The world, and I'm going to say several very obvious things that everyone knows, but I think it's important too to acknowledge, okay, this is where we stand. Now we move forward. So obviously the world has shifted. How people connect to one another has changed. Yep. I mean, even over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a significant shift in how people connect with one another. That has a huge relationship to how people around the world connect. I mean, when I was in high school and graduating high school, the internet was not yet a thing. That happened near the end of my college time. And just since then, obviously, it's blown up, and there's so much more that is a part of how people relate to and connect one another. I mean, just being able to do this podcast 20 years ago, the technology did not exist on our level. I mean, it was out there. You could spend thousands of dollars to get computers and cameras and all that kind of stuff, but you would also have nowhere to put it.
Yeah, exactly.
You could record it and put it on videotape and go, here, you should watch.
You need a ham radio, right?
Right.
We're broadcasting on ham radio station.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So all of that is pretty obvious, and then that relates obviously to how people connect to the church, how they understand God. And how that has shifted. And again, really clear, God has not changed in all of this.
Right.
We as people have changed, and how we relate to and connect to one another has impact on how we relate to and connect to God. And it's important to acknowledge that. I think that's extraordinarily important. So as I was kind of making these notes, I really landed on, this is kind of my wheelhouse of, I always think about what this means for leadership. And so basically the rest of my comments through this episode are going to be related to leadership, because that is immediately where my mind went. That this is largely about leadership, the way that leaders lead, how things are done in the corporate world, what that means and how that connects to the church world. I immediately started thinking about companies, modern companies like Google, like Amazon, where obviously there's still a person that's in charge, but the entire structure of those kinds of companies has flattened a little bit to where someone that is not in the penthouse, who is not in the boardroom, has the opportunity to speak into the direction of the company and the future of the company, with the idea being there's a simple philosophy. It raises the level of the entire company. It's not just one person setting direction and saying, this is what we're going to do. Now, granted, I still think that happens at those companies.
Sure. Yep.
But the voices they have input into that has grown. That's grown a lot.
Well, and I think it's fairly safe to say too. I mean, you think about just in the Christian circles, right? In the church circles, you look at these pastors who are, maybe you view as being really successful or whatever. And chances are, right, they have a circle of people around them that you go, they're not that good on their own, right? They've got these people that are speaking into them, or that are encouraging them, or helping them with leadership things as well. And so, yeah, I mean, you've got to have a team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The more people you have on that, the more people you can, as you said, right, bring up with you or bring forward with you, or the better.
And some of this speaks to the recognition that there needs to be imagination active in the organization, whatever. And this isn't just about church. I mean, that's where we're going to kind of center our conversation. But the necessity, and the use of imagination in the next steps forward is at a premium right now. And it's kind of interesting. Winston Churchill and Albert Einstein both speak to this. Winston Churchill once said, "The empires of the future will be the empires of imagination." That's pretty. I think that's pretty fascinating when you consider the time that he lived in. And saying, look, our imagination has to be tapped if we're going to move forward into what is next for us as a world. And then Albert Einstein says, "I am enough of an artist," a scientist saying, "I am enough of an artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world." And as I read both of those, I started to wonder a couple of questions. Is that true? Is imagination that significant, that critical? And if so, we need to explore why. Why it is that imagination is that critical, and then how is that something that will be implemented and put into place in the structure and the activity of our organization, the church.
Well, and I think another question to that is, why is it? Let me say this: if it's true, why is it that in the church we have such a hard time tapping into imagination, right? And getting people to tap into that and to think that way? I mean, that has been one of the greatest frustrations and heartaches in ministry for me, is trying to get people to think imaginatively about the kingdom of God, because I think, about like Winston Churchill says about the empires, the kingdom of God is a kingdom of imagination, right? If the kingdom is breaking into this world, it's only restricted by the imagination of the people of God and how much we let it break in, right? How much we participate with it. So I think that's a thing to explore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I would say yes, it's true. To that first question. And why? We serve a God who is imaginative, right? We serve a God who creates and creates from nothing, and this, he invites us to be co-creators with him. And to be imaginative with him.
This is, I think one of the things that's tough with us, and again, with us being, I think I can still say younger guys, somewhat younger guys, I'll tread carefully here, but, there's that old guard that still exists, right? This is the way we've always done it. And I mean, like you said, even just with the streaming and stuff, and again, thankful that, we all have leaderships within our churches that understand, I have guys that maybe don't quite understand how it all works or why we need it, but they go, I realize that that's where the world's at.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I realize that this is how we need to communicate now.
I
realize that this is what we need to spend the money on. Right?
Oh boy, yeah.
And I have some buddies in some other churches, where the same thing, where that leadership is being handed off kind of to the next generation, and I think it's scary. right? I think it's scary, especially when we go, well, that's not the way we did it. But it's that same thing. Well, but imagine for me how we could do it new. And again, and I think, as you said, hopefully later we'll get to some questions there, but there's that fine line between reliving the glory days and going, but what was it about, right? There was something. It wasn't the program, or it wasn't it was the people, it was the relationships, it was the fellowship, it was the discipleship, it was all those things. Not that we need to recreate that program 40 years later, because that's probably not going to work. But there's some of those core elements that don't change. Right, that we need to reimagine. So I'm all for imagination, certainly.
It's funny as you say that. I'm thinking, how often the church, we talk about the glory days, right, or things, and some of those things we could recapture, right? The relationships, the pieces of culture that kind of propped up the church a little bit that we didn't have to think about back then. If we're willing to make some sacrifices in our lives now, we could recapture them, right? If what was great about it back then was the church was the crux of our community, we could make that happen again. We might have to give up some things in our life and not work as many hours and not do so many vacations and do those, but we want to have the glory days and do everything else we're already doing.
Cake and eat it too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I never really thought about it in those terms until you said that.
Well, before we hit record, what you said about the questions, there's something we went through in grad school called appreciative inquiry, and I'm very interested to see if that will line up with, because it's that same kind of thing, right? You get people to, well, tell me about your most alive times within this organization, right? So whether it be a business or a church, team, whatever. And again, where you go, okay, it was about discipleship. There was some older couple that took you in, right? That loved on you, that helped you with your marriage, helped you with your kids.
And that's sometimes we have to just take the things that happened and boil them down to what the root of all of it is. And the root really should be transferable.
Yes.
Should
right?
be.
Should be.
Yes.
What are the things that we can bring forward that don't compromise our relationship with God, that don't compromise our relationship with the city or the town or the neighborhood we are planted in? And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But what are the things that come forward easily? Well, relationships. That is absolutely central. Yeah. There in regards to imagination, one of the things that I wrote down here, this was a quote from Rick Warren, probably, I'm trying to think when this was, easily 20 years ago. He said the New Testament church did not have buildings for like 300 years.
Yeah.
Didn't have a building. And it just made me think, and that was one of the reasons he said in that quote, it's one of the reasons they delayed in building their first facility. But it got me thinking, imagination and how we use our buildings. That is maybe a very an important beginning conversation. How are we using our facilities? Is this something that is largely for the people that already go here, the people that already know Jesus, or is there a sense in the community that place is for everybody? Mm-hmm. And that takes some imagination to kind of reframe that, rethink that.
Well, and especially in our context, right? We are rural Michigan. Is there 60,000 people in Gratiot County?
40.
There's only 40. I thought there was 50. Whatever, doesn't matter.
Well, I don't know what this year's census was, but 40 is the number.
From 2010, right? So not a huge county, right? But some of our church buildings are some of the nicest facilities that our county has.
Yeah.
And so the same thing, like with you guys thinking, hey, we're going to make this into a homeless shelter, right? The same thing. I mean, look at our church and going, besides the schools, we're one of the few places that have a gym. Right. So the same thing. Yeah. How are we utilizing that? How are we, right? Whether it be an outreach or just a service, like you said, just something that's available. And I think, especially as we talked about the last couple of weeks, right, as we, unfortunately or whatever it is, move into this more post-church, post-Christian culture that we find ourselves in. What do we do? Mm-hmm. Right? Same thing with this building here, right? What do we do with this building? How can we better serve the community? Yeah. Whether it be, maybe it's office space, right? Maybe it is another home church or something that is growing and needs a place
Right.
to worship, whatever it may be. But,
Well, you mentioned this building where we are shooting this is what is quickly becoming the former Church of God building for the city of St. Louis. And when we started talking about merging our congregations into one, which has now become official, the question that we immediately started talking about was, what do we do with this building? Because we're not worshiping in this facility on Sunday mornings. And immediately we both said, well, I don't think we can get rid of it because there are significant ministries happening on this premises that really can't go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And then that acknowledgement right out of the gate, I mean, because it could have been the kind of thing, well, I don't know how we're going to support two facilities. I don't know how we're going to do this. We probably need to cut bait and get rid of it. We'll see if XYZ company wants to buy it and just rid ourselves. And it would be, maybe $100,000 that could come in, and that would really help us. True, that would have helped us. But it didn't address the ministry that is happening here and that can move forward. And that decision has spun us out into all kinds of other possibilities, stuff that we hadn't even thought of when we started the conversation. But the willingness to say, let's give it a shot. Yep. Let's be imaginative about what God might do.
Well, and this is, again, too, right, I think with being leaders that are adaptive to how the culture is changing. I mean, as we're in a COVID, I wouldn't quite say we're post-COVID yet, but you're going, how much need for office space is there really going to be? Right? This year is just a shift of people working from home. I mean, this is, talking to one of my buddies who works in Grand Rapids. I mean, he's seriously, that's a worry of his, of going, there is going to be just a wasteland of commercial office space that will probably be empty.
Yeah.
Probably forever. So the same thing, right? How do we have, is it time to have a Christian school? We've, and who's going to bite that bullet? but not it, right? That's not your calling, right?
Yeah,
but
the homeless shelter.
Yes, I know. So,
right.
But again, right? How do we engage the imagination and,
yes.
and take, I'm sure it's the same thing in your circles too. You have people, well, we need to be good stewards. Yeah, we do, but having a building that's sitting here empty 6 days a week,
yes.
I don't think that's being a good steward of this wonderful facility or facilities that God's given us.
And the truth is, imagination is dangerous and it is scary because you end up walking out of conversations about imagination with more questions than answers. And there are some folks that cannot see past the first initial hurdle of, okay, because the first hurdle is, what do we do with all of these questions that you just threw out here on the table? And nobody knows how to pick them up, and nobody knows how to answer them. And the minute we answer one question, 3 more fall out. How do we deal with that? And there are some people who cannot get past the pile of questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We need to stop getting to how. Because you can get to how are we going to answer this question? You can get to that too quickly, because if you go too quickly, you say, well, we can't deal with that. Mm-hmm. As it stands right now, I don't have answers for that stuff. And there are some people who go, okay, then we're out. There's no imagination to say no.
Right.
None. It takes zero imagination to say, no, we're not going to do that.
And the questions, the response to that becomes, I think, how do we just, in faithfulness, take these steps in bringing people along in that? I mean, because that's a very familiar story for us, right? What if we started a homeless shelter?
Right.
Well, the board meetings that I sat in, both on a local level and district level, going, how? And it was, we had to just keep asking for space to continue seeking the process. In fact, that was the first thing I asked my board. I'm not asking you to approve starting a shelter. I'm asking you for your blessing to continue to ask the questions to pursue it. And they said, yes. When we started the merger process, it was the same thing, right? There was, if you didn't have any imagination for the how, or to get beyond the how, people shut down, and we lost folks over that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we just yesterday had lunch with our new district superintendent, and very in the course of our conversation, he said, I'll be honest, there weren't many of us who thought you two were going to pull this off, that this was ever going to work. And he didn't say it despairingly.
No, right.
I mean, it was almost like very celebratory. Like, we don't know how you did it, and it was just trying to encourage people to be faithful, to have some imagination, to go the next step, and man, God's hand was in it.
I'll brag on you two guys for a while, because I do. I think there's some people in our church, I mean, they kind of know the story, and it's the same thing. They're just going, oh my gosh, right?
Right.
And there's part of me that's going, I think personally, I think you guys are on the front end, right? I think of what the church is gonna have to do.
Yeah.
And again, as you guys have talked about, not just to survive, but right to continue to have worth, to have some sort of impact in the community. And again, in our situation may be a little unique because we do have good working relationships with most of the congregations in St. Louis and in Elma, which is phenomenal.
Right.
But it's one of those things, you go, church, if you want to still be relevant, you need to start building those relationships
Absolutely.
Yes.
with other churches. Again, we go back to the kingdom thing, right? You go, if we're going to spend eternity together and we can't get along here,
Yeah, I mean,
So I just kudos to you guys because I think you guys are. I think you guys are on the front end of a wave that in 5 years I think it'll be that's what everybody's doing. Joining forces, combining resources, combining mission, probably the most important thing, right? Combining
Yes.
mission and going, let's get behind this and let's do this together.
But the truth is, in a lot of ways, the hardest work was done for us because there was years of churches in this community rejecting that competitive nature, right?
Yeah.
And deciding we're going to come together for the greater
That's really
good
true.
and work together. Especially with the shelter, we just had to capitalize on a lot of that work. And even with the merger, it brought it closer to home. But I mean, in a different community, I don't know that you could have done. Not that, and I don't say that to refute your point. I think your point is right. But I just mean, I think the reason maybe we could be on the front edge of that is because for at least a decade or longer, the churches here have been working so hard at overcoming all of that that two churches merging together for the sake of mission really wasn't all that foreign of an idea. It was a natural progression in many ways.
I remember when we sat at breakfast one Monday morning, and we had just come from I guess it was a meeting the day before where we decided to officially pursue the merging, and we told, and there was a decent group there that morning. We told everybody, and everybody's kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. There was not a shock. I mean, nobody was surprised at that. And that probably speaks to what you're talking about, of the sense of participating in mission together, laying aside the things that are different about us, and celebrating and leaning into the things that make us connected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'm just... well, I don't care. we just have our moms watching anyways, right? Doesn't matter.
We're lucky.
In our circle of churches, I mean, it's sad because we have a bunch of them right here in Central Michigan that hardly ever get together and do anything together, and it's still a lot of that old school, right? This is my bean field, it's my people. You stay in your corner, I'll stay in my corner. And you're like, because then our leadership, we talk about that, going, well, why can't we do more things with, it's a tough crowd. But again, there's been a good fellowship here.
Well, and you saying that makes me realize, too, that because we've had, and this is true in every city, every town where there are multiple churches, people will bounce from one place to another.
Inevitably.
There's nothing you can do to control that, stop that.
Yeah.
Our relationship with one another in the city of St. Louis has been, if somebody comes to my church and they're from yours, I'm going to ask them right away, have you talked to your pastor? Not that I'm telling you can't be here, and I'm not telling you that you shouldn't be here or anything like that. But there is such a shared love for the city and one another that we go, I don't want there ever to be any bad blood, anything like oh, it looks like I stole somebody from. No, that's not going to happen because we're friends enough to say the mission and the kingdom, what you had mentioned earlier, that's more important than any of this.
You shut down so much drama too, because maybe you have somebody. Well, Pastor so and so didn't. Well, you know what? When I see them tomorrow at breakfast,
right.
Okay. So stop bad mouthing them because I'm not going to play that game.
Yes, right.
And it just.
And again, so this back to the initial question. No, this is. I think this is good because that kind of participation and working with one another requires a different kind of imagination than the traditional. Go back 50 years. 50 years ago, there wasn't this kind of shared understanding of the kingdom of God. There just wasn't. This kind of participation requires a different kind of imagination about how things can be.
And again, and this just goes back to even, I think, that bigger conversation, right, of how culture is shifting. And again, right, I just bring this back to the martial arts thing, right, where you go, well, my style's the best. Well, no, karate's the best. Well, this, right. And in the last 25 years, you've seen this mixed martial arts evolve. And it's been that same thing of going, that's got something to offer, you've got something to offer. And right, I think you're seeing that with the tech companies going, oh, I like how they did that with their app. And, oh, they got that with, that's kind of cool with their app. What if we made an app that combined all those neat features and, you know, roll out the next new thing or whatever. And so, just that collaboration of working together. And
So these, our overarching issue, our overarching question for today is, what does this mean for the church going forward? With imagination as a foundational piece, but what does that actually mean? So this is a document that I've been kind of adding to over the last couple of years, and I don't know if we'll make this available. You guys tell me if this is something that we should kind of post as a PDF or whatever. But these are just questions of a church that I have kind of, just the stuff that I've read and listened to, have kind of shaped some things about how I think about church. So I'm just going to give a couple of these, and we'll kind of let our conversation run through this. So what is our connection and relationship to the poor and fringe of the city? Do we see a ministry to the poor as a rescue, which is an important question to ask, or is it simply helping those that are in need? We can't see people as projects. They must be seen as brother and sister. And what is the neighborhood in greatest need? Are we doing ministry there?
Wow.
So that first one, what is our connection and relationship to the poor and the fringe of the city? Some churches really embrace this well. But many churches have found themselves consistently removed from the poor and the fringe.
I like that you when in that question or the follow-up, the word rescue.
Yeah.
Your rescue. Because what comes to my mind is like search and rescue, Coast Guard, right?
Yeah.
I was watching, this has been a while ago, that movie, The Perfect Storm, again.
Yeah.
Hadn't watched it in years. And, you know, and that movie, it largely follows the fishing boat but it's also, there's a few other boats and people that were caught in this storm that it highlights, right? And the Coast Guard helicopter, they go out, and when they find the boat that's in distress, right, you have at least one, if not two guys who jump into the water from the helicopter in these large running waters, and they're in the water with these folks, and they're helping lift them to safety and all of that. That's rescue, right? Rescue requires us not to stay in the safety of shore or even the helicopter, but jumping in the water, getting down in it with you, and helping to raise you up out of it. And it comes at great cost. Like even that video, some of those guys in the rescue teams perished in that.
Yeah.
It can come at great cost to us. It can require a lot of us. It requires a great deal of vulnerability. But that is the difference between rescue and just saying, you know, we're going to help those, you know, who are in need. We're going to give handouts. We're going to meet some perceived need. And I think it requires, you know, the incarnation again, right? It's coming right back to the incarnation, the in the fleshness of it all.
That's what, you know, we're so we have a food pantry, you know, actually running today, and it's the same thing. You know, I have some folks that are, and again, because we do get some government subsidized things with that, you know, you can't directly proselytize, you know, but you can have things out. And so same thing there. I've had those philosophical conversations again with some of the older folks in our church of going, man, shouldn't we have like a bulletin out or some information about the church? I said we can, but you know, the time is, and it is, there's folks that come every month that our people know by first name. You know, there's something about walking a cart of groceries out to somebody's car and being able to talk with them for a couple minutes and load their car, and you find out what's going on in their life. And in the same thing, well, we're not seeing any of them come to church. Well, hang on, is that why we're doing the food pantry?
Right.
Is to get people to come in to church on Sunday, or are we doing the food pantry because there's folks in our community, right, for whatever reason, whether they are in a desperate need, or we're just helping them stretch their dollars further, or whatever it may be, right? What's the purpose here?
And that's, I mean, there is such significance in that, right? And I heard a message preached years ago by one of our former general superintendents called 5-Minute Ministry, I think is what and he looked at different moments in Scripture where Jesus spends about 5 minutes with people. The woman at the well, the woman of adultery, right? And once he learned that, he made it a discipline. So then he just told the stories about the people in his life that are 5 minutes. It's Tina down at 7-Eleven where he goes to get his coffee every morning, right?
Yep.
It's the mail guy. And they may not come to church ever or right away, but you begin to hear a little bit about their story, and you begin to know them. And when and they tell you something next time, how is that situation going again? How's your mom doing? I know she's not been well. And you begin, and then when they have a need, they begin to connect you with love and compassion, and they begin to connect God with that because they know you represent God. And he shared one story about how this guy ultimately became a Christian, was saved, and then when Dr. Deal's son passed away from cancer, it was that guy who came to their house to pray with them. Right? But that took like a decade or more, right? Yeah. And I think, and again, that's incarnation. I mean, that was when the bakery was open downtown. I made a discipline to just go in there every morning to get a cup of coffee, so I could get to know Brenda and the ladies there and just talk with them and know who they were.
Well, think about we had George Showers passed away this year, and by all accounts, right, the pastor of Gratiot County, right. And again, part of that was, he had been a superintendent right out at Vestaburg. He'd been a principal, I think, here in St. Louis. Part of that was, just ingrained in the community. But that's how you do it, right? It's that, And again, I remember talking to him even just a year ago of he was doing a couple funerals every week almost. Yeah. Because for I don't know how many families in this community, what was their one connection to Christ? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was Pastor George Showers, right? Like that's anytime I've been in need, anytime I've needed some sort of spiritual guidance or care, that's the guy. Yep, that's the guy. And so, and again, and we could argue the other side of that, right? Of where's the discipleship and the fellowship and all those things, but I don't know.
Do you ever wonder why in those 5-minute interactions that Jesus has with different people, there's no follow-up story? I've always kind of wondered that, and I wonder if part of the reason that there's no follow-up story, well, one, maybe the disciples didn't know the follow-up story, but we get so hung up on completing the whole process. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's part of the reason the follow-up story isn't there. Yeah. Because it could give us too much of this is a formula because this is what Jesus did and this is what happened when Jesus... And then we get so tied up in the completion of something that we completely lose track of the relationship that is built in those short little snippets. Yeah, you know what? Maybe there is someone that you have a connection with that you never get to disciple. Does that mean that you don't connect with them over the counter at the 7-Eleven? Yeah. Biblically, it doesn't seem accurate at all. Right. Doesn't seem fair.
And I think our need for completion, is evidence of our inability to truly trust the Holy Spirit and to trust Christ. Right? Yes. Because what does that say? That says, as a conduit of the Holy Spirit in these moments, I'm going and I am imparting grace to these folks. Yep. And I can trust that God, the Holy Spirit, is able to work in that moment and work in their heart without me manipulating the situation and ensuring that there's follow through. The discipleship isn't important and there's not a place for it. It is. Right. But that's a different conversation than I think this one. And I think this is the stuff that the church has been missing of late. Okay. And I don't know that it's really... I think it's maybe not our fault so much. In the time when everybody in church went to the town, it's one of the same 3 churches, right? And if you didn't go to church, that was known too, and that community was really your community. 5-minute ministry is what that guy I heard called it. That didn't matter quite so much, right? True. Because everybody was connected to the church or connected to each other. Who was connected to a church, and it was all in a world where the world is flat, so to speak, right? And we're connected around the world, but not so much at home anymore, and all of those things. That becomes really important, and I think the church just hasn't fully caught up to that and realized this is one of the ways we have to adjust and change. One of the things we can't presume on anymore. And I hope we
Well,
get
and you just talk about, you mentioning George Showers is, I think, particularly poignant because I know that people, I mean, that funeral was crazy packed.
Yeah.
There were hundreds of people from around the county that went to that funeral. And I know that if you pressed people and said, well, what did you know about George? He loved God and he loved me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know athletes because he was particularly connected to Ithaca sports in the last, 20 years or so. And God, that guy had everything. I remember talking to him at a basketball game the previous winter. I know athletes who have said, if I was ever in trouble, I knew I could call George.
Exactly.
I knew I could because he would listen, he would care about me, he would give me good counsel.
Yep.
I know those kids who would have called him and did call him.
Yeah.
He was Christ to this community.
He was.
Yeah. He was, right?
And to me, and this goes back to kind of an earlier conversation, right? Of I don't need to try to be like Pastor George Showers,
Right.
But I need to
Yeah.
embody those things of being available, being present, being right, having a good witness, having a good reputation. I mean, it's the same, and I'm sure you guys too, right? I mean, there's been a handful of families in the time I've been here that done grandma's funeral, done grandpa's funeral. It's the only time I've ever seen them step foot in a church,
Right.
And again, and use those moments to encourage them. I mean, there's this one family just last year. I mean, did two. I was shocked that they actually had me do the second funeral because I think I did a good job the first time. But you said, man, look, we got 300 people. You guys got a huge family. Your grandma wasn't crazy. She loved Jesus. Right? And all these stories that we're hearing, this is all because your grandmother had an encounter with Christ. Right? And what would happen? How could we change this community? The 300 people that are just here in this room.
Right.
If you would act more like your grandmother, who embodied Christ, right?
Yeah.
And I think just more of those conversations, right? That you just say, hey, let's, Grandpa and Grandma weren't crazy.
Right.
Right? They,
I'm reminded of that passage in, I think it's in 1 Corinthians when Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ, right?
Yeah.
And his willingness to put himself out there as a leader in the church and say, I will embody, for your sake, I will embody Christ, and you can follow me.
Yeah.
Right? I think that was George in our community, but that's a lot of other folks too. And I think we have to approach our life as followers of Christ in that way. We want to so often say, well, don't look at me, look at Jesus. He's the one, which is again, reflective of our inability to trust grace and the Holy Spirit and really the fact, the incarnational nature of our faith. It says we as the church, we are representative of Christ, and we ought to be able to look at one another. We ought to be able to use each other as examples. We ought to be able to follow each other's footsteps, and following our Lord. Because if we can't, then we're probably not that faithful to begin with.
Ouch. Yeah, you're
So
right.
in
Get us back on that.
yeah,
Sorry,
or leave
I didn't
that
mean to-
tension. No.
I didn't mean to
I think
derail.
this is very good for us to talk about. So in relation to the imagination that it needs to be present, and I don't know that this is an accurate stat, but I've heard a couple people talk about this, suggesting that somewhere between 90 and 98% of local church budgets are tied up in those who are already saved. Staffing, Sunday morning execution, that kind of stuff.
Execution.
Well,
I know.
yes.
Programming
of, not execution, we'll use better words. Is that number changeable and I'm not even necessarily asking in our current context, but is that number changeable, and is that number up for, can we evaluate that number honestly and be able to say, okay, that number is too high. There's X percent that is dedicated to maintaining programs, staffing, building maintenance, all that kind of stuff, which is all necessary. It's all important, because if you have a building, now you are responsible by God to maintain and not let it just fall down. There's some stewardship there. How does that number get change? How does that number get reevaluated? I don't think that's an easy question to answer by any means, and there are too many folks that go, I can't answer any of those questions, so I'm out.
Yeah. I was just a quick, I was gonna say, I went to grad school like 8 years ago. With most of the guys were from the Detroit area, and one of the guys, he was youth minister at I think a church back in its heyday was probably 1,000 members. I mean, they had I don't remember if he said the auditorium sat 500-600 people,
Wow.
but there were like 30 people that were there. Now, whenever that was. But I mean, the same thing. This building was literally just falling down, and you go, how sad.
Yeah.
Right? How sad. Somebody there missed the imagination, right? Or missed the shift, or missed something to go, yeah, we need to do something different. And but
I think that that's a both and question.
yeah.
Because yes, it can change, but no, it won't change unless we're willing to again practice some imagination and do some hard things.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where it comes back to, if your budget is that high on just maintaining, you're never going to accomplish mission. So you got to figure out how you can reduce your maintenance expenses, and maintenance not being just building maintenance, right? But maintaining the organization, the infrastructure. And I think it requires some imagination, some creativity to look at that and say, and I think these are things churches have to deal with these days, right? I think we are in a huge shift in the culture of the church, that big budget, big operation churches are going to continue to dwindle off in number, and I think they're going to be fewer and far between, and that the church is going to have to be willing to find ways to operate on lower budgets, because the world is changing in many ways, and I think that's not all bad.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, because for how long our answer was just throwing money at stuff, and how many faithful followers of Christ do we have to show for it? Most of them left the church when they turned 18 or 20 years old.
Right.
Right? Or when their kids turned 18 or 20 years old, they left the church. Right?
Yeah.
So what do we have to show for it? I mean, so I think that sure, we may have a building, but if we're hoarding that building for our own purposes, for when we want to gather into it, that's never going to change. Sure, we got to pay staff, but if you get your staff thinking imaginatively about other ways and other things, kinds of ministries they can do, you probably can cut that number down in time. I mean,
that's okay. Maybe I'm not sure if we have the time or space here, but I mean, do you see more guys probably going bivocationally or tent making? Is that kind of the?
I mean, that's something we talked about yesterday at our lunch. Was that we both feel very much like what we are doing in having in running the shelter and having the shelter supplement our income. That is. We really both think that is a wave of the future of pastoral ministry. That there is something else that dumps into because we have to have an income. There's no escaping that.
Sure.
You can't. That was probably never a reality. That the pastor didn't have to have an income,
unless we want to go the commune route. But we're not that crazy.
You're not kidding.
Yeah. So with that in mind. This is where the imaginative part comes in. How do I support my family in ways that feed into the ministry that God has called me to? Because, I mean, we're not doing this homeless shelter thing because we were bored.
Yeah.
That was something that was on both of our hearts for a long time and took and continues to be a huge portion of our weekly output as far as what we're doing.
Time, energy.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I absolutely think that is true. So there has to be some imagination on how do I supplement my income so that I can take care of my family, but how does that also then supplement the ministry focus and the mindset of the church that God has called me to lead?
Yep.
And not every, and it's going to be different for everybody. I mean, some people, it might have to go be a secular trade.
Sure,
sure. And that can be ministry, right? But I think we were fortunate and blessed enough that there was a need in our community that we could meet in a way that really makes it feel like it's one job.
Sure, sure.
And it's seamless. And so I would, again, imagination, right?
Yeah.
What are the needs in your community that your church can meet?
We got to get the T-shirt division of GOSPELjazz launched.
For your second job?
We have like 6 or 7 killer T-shirt ideas that will sell like hotcakes.
Or fireable.
Well, yeah, or get us canned. So I don't know. It'll be great.
Here is another.
Sorry,
that's okay.
Keep going.
Here is another question. This will be the last one that I'll kind of pose, and then I don't know, how long are we going?
I'm not sure.
I don't want us to go too long so that we're
at 45 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this will. Okay, this one we may not have to. Well, I'll just read it. Tradition or the way it's always been, and then, again, this is a question that is asked of a church. Is this a high value, and can you provide evidence for your answers? So the way it's always been, the tradition of what we've always done, is this a high value? And what evidence is there to support? Because some people will say, well, no, of course not. No, the way it's always been, no, we're willing to explore. Okay, what are the evidences for that answer?
Yeah.
And that, boy, I'm telling you what, that gets to some hardcore self-evaluation that is really hard to escape, which is partly why I think these kinds of questions are very difficult for a church that has been stuck. Because I've asked that question in particular, I've asked of churches that I've served, and I'm telling you what, the seat shifting and the uncomfortable and kind of looking up and no eye contact. I mean, it is palpable.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we're willing to change our traditions as long as we do them the way we've always done them.
Yes, right.
Now, as you said that, traditions and how we've always done things, I wonder, maybe this is splitting hairs, but are those two different things?
It could be, yeah.
Right?
Sure.
Are traditions the things that we do with purpose?
Okay.
And that have significant meaning, and the way we've always done things are just the way we've done things. They maybe, their meaning was how they functioned for a time, and do we conflate the two? Right? There are traditions I'm not willing to part with.
Right.
The Lord's Supper, for example, right?
Sure.
As an example, right?
Yes, sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the way we've always done the Lord's Supper might need to be reevaluated.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Gathering together for worship. But how we've done that 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings might need to be reevaluated. Right. I mean, for those, and so is there room enough to separate those two things out within the church and to say these are the traditions which we cannot, they're the staples, and here, but how we've done them.
Yeah.
And there's some things that we've just always done that don't have any traditional value.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
Like sat in pews.
Like
I'll say it. Because we're pulling ours out.
I heard about a church that had...
We are not yet. Okay. Yeah, COVID has... Oh, my gosh.
I heard about a church that they had brought in some sort of a ministry consultant type person. The pastor had been there long enough, and he realized there's some stagnation here, some stuff that I don't even see. So they bring in this person, and they gave him, and this was gutsy on their part. We give you free reign. You look at everything and give us your honest feedback on stuff. And this guy had never been to that church. He was not a part. He was not in the community. He didn't know that. He knew the lead pastor, and that was really it. So he came back and gave some evaluation on some things. One thing that he asked them, I think it was every spring, late in spring, they would have some sort of big pancake breakfast. And I think it was on a Sunday morning before church. And he said, what is the ministry purpose of that? And everybody, he said, this was a very telling moment. Everybody on the table went, I don't know. I mean, we do it. It's fun. It's great. And the pastor even said, I love that thing. That's great. It's so great. But they really evaluated it through the lens of ministry purpose. What was the ministry purpose of doing that? If it's a gathering, a social gathering of the people, okay, that's fine. But if you want to evaluate things that don't have a real significant ministry purpose, you need to look at that and say, maybe we don't do that anymore.
Right. Yeah. And I think we're in a day in the church when we have to be willing to evaluate everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because, again, coming back to the world has changed.
Right.
And we have to have, again, our ability to trust the Holy Spirit. We have to have the faith that the church will endure, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to wreck the church. Doesn't matter what shenanigans we might pull. God's faith church has endured far more
Yeah.
Right.
than that. and change might be difficult, might be painful, but the church shall endure, right? Christ says, "I will build my church."
Yeah.
So I think that's something important to be remind ourselves of, is despite what we face within our world, despite the change we might have to make, the pain, Christ church will survive.
Yeah.
Because I think coming back to the tradition or the way we've always done things, right? That's the fear, right? So I don't want the church to crumble, or I don't want the church to go away, or I don't.
Right.
You're like,
yes,
dude, it was here 1,800 years before you came along.
We think we got it out. We think we're real important, don't we?
Yeah.
And and
I take the TPS reports down to Debbie. I'm meaningful.
And I said that a little tongue in cheek, right?
No,
The people are important. They matter, and you have to understand they have poured years and their heart into things, and we've got to give people space to sort that out, deal with their grief.
I mean, it's kind of like the Exodus, right? As they come into the Promised Land, right? There you go. Hey, there are vineyards you didn't plant, right? There are homes you didn't build, right? Just be thankful. And the same thing, I kind of like you even said about just coming into a culture and environment that was already good and healthy. But I mean, it's the same. The same is true in all of our churches, right? I mean, we do, right? We stand on the shoulders of those that have gone before us, and again, they were faithful, and we hope and pray that we'll continue to be faithful and. You
can't be too dogmatic about some of that kind of stuff, and you've got to give people. I was having that conversation with somebody the other day about COVID and moving back inside in the arguments there, and he said, I got one side that's saying if you go back inside, you don't love people because you're gonna. Yeah. And this wasn't in his church. This is conversations he's watching pastors have as they're sorting it out, right? You got one group of people who are saying, if you move back inside, you're threatening people's health and you don't love people. And if you don't move back inside, you don't love the church and you're threatening the church. He goes, and I just don't know what side is right. And I said, that's the moment where you have to realize you can't be too dogmatic about it and decide, in the decision I'm making, am I being faithful, a faithful witness of Christ? Yeah. The answer to that is yes. Then move forward in grace.
Right.
That's all you can do.
Yeah.
Right?
That's an important statement right there when we think about what it means for the church going forward, is to understand that there are not a whole lot of concrete answers right now. There are more questions than there are answers. But to stand still, kind of frozen in fear of, well, if I make the wrong decision, this could crumble. I mean, okay, we've already addressed that. The church is not going to crumble.
Right.
The church will be here long after we're dead and gone.
Yeah.
But as a leader, have to be willing to pick a direction, to say, I'm going to do the best with what I know for right now.
What'd you do with your one talent? Well, I buried it because I was scared. Knew you was a tough guy, and I knew, and I didn't want to disappoint you. Dude, you should have at least taken the two and did something with him like this guy. I mean, it's that same.
And realizing if you make it, the church will endure. That doesn't mean that First Church on the corner of First and Pine.
Yes.
And so sometimes death is part of growth.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
You've got to die.
Theology.
Resurrection and realize. I am convinced, and again, I don't want to make this too dogmatic because of the implications of it, but if Christ says, I will build my church, maybe sometimes the churches that God builds, we can build our own empires through our own means, but the ones that God builds, sometimes the churches don't grow because they're not safe. They're not a safe environment for His people.
Yeah.
Right. And if a toxic church dies, what loss is it to the kingdom? Which might be a little too forcefully stated, but it's worth wrestling with, right? And so that's a piece of this to wrestle with in there
Cut
too.
off every branch that doesn't bear fruit, and I prune the ones
and
that,
you know what?
that do bear. I mean,
those folks in that church think that they're, bearing good fruit. But if they're a toxic church and they die, what loss is it to the kingdom?
I
agree with you.
That's
what you said earlier, anyway.
That's what I said. What? Putting words into my mouth. I didn't say anything that eloquent at all. What are you?
All right, I will conclude.
Yeah. You're gonna wrap things up on that
Before I really put my foot in my mouth. Could you end this thing?
So if your church is dying, it's your fault.
Yeah. I think there are two places that I landed in just thinking about what this means for us. I think there are two things, at least two things. It's probably a ton more, but at least two things. One, I think we need to talk about what it means to reconstruct our gatherings.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, and I'll go back and we can break these down a little bit. So we need to reconstruct our gatherings. We also need to re-engage the place that we're planted. So reconstructing our gatherings would, in relationship to our weekly worship gatherings, are we attributing worth to God? Because that's where our word worship comes from. It's originally pronounced worthship, where we are attributing to the things that we say, sing, pray, and teach. We're attributing worth to God. Is that really happening in our gatherings? Do these things that we do on a weekly basis, do they invoke discipleship? Or are they kind of a self-contained, this is the box for Sunday, and outside of that, there's no real impact? I would dare say that the modern mindset is that what happens on Sunday stays in Sunday, and it doesn't travel beyond Sunday at 12:30 or whenever your church gets out. Is this gathering, this is reconstructing our gatherings, is this gathering for believers or non-believers?
So the re-engagement
Yeah.
of the community.
Yeah, so then that leads us into
Yeah.
this other piece, the re-engagement of the place we are planted. Are we, the church, reflective of Christ outside of Sunday mornings? I mean, because everybody recognizes that people go to church because they think that's where God is, that God has told them they have to go to church, or whatever the assumptions are. And they go, church isn't for me, but that's fine for them. Fine, go to church. But are we reflective of Christ outside of the church? Outside of Sunday morning? Are we physically engaged with the community in valuable ways and not just philosophically engaged? So we'll talk about things that are maybe politically important to us. That's still a philosophical engagement to some degree. I mean, we'll vote a certain way, but other than that, are we more than philosophically engaged? And is it a valuable engagement? And I wrote down, this might going to make some folks upset. Is it more than just VBS and hosting a trunk or treat? Now, I got nothing against either one of those things. Well, I don't really like VBS, but that's fine if a church wants to do that. But I don't know that is a true test of your engagement or a true measure of your engagement with the community.
Yeah.
Because largely VBS has turned into the church kids bounce around from one VBS to another, and maybe there's a little bit of a connection to the community, but it's not like when I went to VBS. I mean, the kids from around the place that I lived, church kids or no, they all came. That has changed because again, the world has changed a little bit.
Well, and I guess my only thought with those when you first posed those two questions is that, you know, one of the good things to maybe potentially come out of this whole COVID year is what a great time to reboot things, right? What a great time to re-engage, right? I mean, things are even if like our church, we are meeting back inside, but we're not in the sanctuary, right? We're in the gym. It looks different. It feels different. It's still not even maybe 50% of the people that were, you know, coming 6-7 months ago, whatever. And so, is there a better time, maybe now than ever, to go, yeah, let's do this a little differently, right? You know, and the same thing, too, of just a strange, I know I've felt very disconnected from people. We've had a fairly aggressive calling program of people calling and checking in on people, whatever, through the church. But, you know, the same thing, is that the same, though, right, as actually having somebody in my home? Right, or going into somebody else's home, and the same thing, just starting to slowly re-engage with that too, of, you know, right, of stopping in and seeing people or having people over. But what a great time maybe to reboot both those things,
right?
You know?
And again, that requires where we began, a sense of imagination.
Yeah.
Am I willing to engage in the things that I don't fully understand even? Am I willing to lurch into the gray out of the black and white.
Yep. Maybe that's another podcast. Well, hey, I think that was good. I think a good discussion. I
It was long. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, right about an hour on the nose. So, hey, we do hope and pray the peace of the Lord is upon you and your family, and that you and your church and whatever situation you might find yourself in, that things are going well for you, and that these discussions have hopefully been helpful and fruitful to you. So, God bless. Thanks for tuning in.